Specter. I only trust Specter. The wounded Admiral's finger swept across a room full of surgeons and specialists and landed on the quietest person in it, the nurse who had spent 3 years absorbing insults from doctors who never once looked at her twice. She wasn't just a nurse. She was the reason men came home from places that didn't exist on any map. The woman, every doctor at Liberty Cross had dismissed without a second thought, had just been identified as one of the most lethal covert field medics the military had ever trained. But her cover wasn't the only thing shattered that night. Someone had followed Admiral Kessler to that hospital, and they hadn't come to watch him survive. If you're new here, this channel tells stories about people who were underestimated, written off, and invisible right up until the moment it mattered most. If that's the kind of story you're here for, hit subscribe and stay with us. This one is just getting started. The night shift at Liberty Cross Trauma Center had a rhythm that Lena Marlowe had memorized the way other people memorized song lyrics, not because she wanted to, but because it was always playing. The low hum of fluorescent lights above the nurses' station. The particular squeak of the supply cart wheels on the third corridor. The sound of Dr. Nathan Corwin's voice carrying through 2 closed doors whenever he decided someone in the room wasn't performing to his standard, which was most evenings and all of the worst ones. Lena had spent 3 years learning the acoustics of this building, the way she had once learned the acoustics of places that didn't appear on civilian maps, not out of curiosity, but out of survival. She wore her scrubs 1 size too large. That had been a deliberate choice in the beginning, and then it stopped being a choice at all. It became simply how she dressed, how she moved through the hallways, how she made sure that nothing about her appearance invited a second look. Her shoulders, which had been trained to carry weight across distances that would have broken most people, stayed slightly rounded when she walked. Her eyes, which had once tracked movement in her peripheral vision, the way a hawk tracks thermals, now stayed directed at charts and medication trays, and the floor directly in front of her feet. She had built her invisibility the way other people built careers, carefully, with intention, reinforcing it every single day until it felt like a second skin. Most of the staff at Liberty Cross had drawn their conclusions about Lena Marlowe within her first few weeks. Quiet, competent enough, a little slow to speak up. Corwin had reached his conclusion faster than most, which was fitting, because Nathan Corwin had a talent for rapid, confident, and almost entirely wrong first impressions. He was the kind of doctor who filled a room the moment he entered it good-looking, in a way he was clearly aware of, articulate in a way he sometimes mistook for intelligence, and absolutely certain that the hierarchy of a trauma unit existed for the purpose of confirming his position at the top of it. He corrected Lena in front of residents. He reassigned her tasks mid-procedure and explained the reassignment to everyone except her. On 3 separate occasions, he had attributed her observations to himself in the presence of the attending physicians, and on each of those occasions, Lena had said nothing, had written nothing in her incident report, had let it pass like weather. She let things pass because drawing attention to herself was more dangerous than absorbing the cost of his behavior. That was the calculation she had made, and she had stuck to it with the same discipline that had once kept her breathing in places where breathing was not guaranteed. The name she had buried was Specter. It wasn't a name anyone had given her sentimentally. It was operational, assigned because of what she could do and what she was nearly impossible to detect doing. For 6 years before Liberty Cross, before Charleston, before the scrubs and the deliberately forgettable face, Lena had been a covert field medic attached to units whose missions were classified at levels most military physicians would never come close to. She had reached wounded soldiers in environments where no conventional extraction was possible. She had performed procedures under conditions that had no resemblance to an OR, no lighting, no backup, no margin. People who had worked alongside her used words like precise and terrifying sometimes in the same sentence. She had brought back men that the mission planners had already written off, and she had done it quietly enough that she was gone before anyone could ask how. And then she had stopped being able to do it. Not because the skill left her, but because something else did, some internal mechanism that had allowed her to keep moving through loss without being dissolved by it. Too many names. Too many faces she had worked over with her hands in the dark and still lost. She had not broken dramatically. She had simply reached a point where she knew with clinical certainty that she could not continue, and the only way out that made sense to her was to disappear so completely that the past had nothing to follow. She changed her paperwork. She moved. She took the Liberty Cross position because it was night shift, because Charleston was large enough to be anonymous in, and because a trauma center was the closest thing to the work she understood while still being a different world entirely. She told herself it was starting over. She was careful not to examine that claim too closely. On the night that Adrian Kessler arrived, Lena was 40 minutes from the end of her shift. The radio call came through to the charge nurse first. High priority inbound gunshot wound. Military escort requesting Trauma Bay 1 to be cleared and staffed. The language was clipped in a way that Lena recognized without quite meaning to the specific economy of words that came from people who communicated under pressure as a professional habit. She positioned herself near the back of the bay, where she could monitor without being the first face anyone looked for, and she watched the doors. The men who came through first were not hospital staff. Cole Danner moved like someone who had spent years making sure no room could surprise him, scanning the exits before his eyes settled on anything else, tracking the position of every person within range. Owen Barrett came in at an angle that covered the approach from the corridor, and Lena noted that both of them had their hands free in the specific way that meant they were ready to use them. Between them on the gurney was Admiral Adrian Kessler, and Lena recognized him 3 full seconds before anyone spoke his name. She had last seen him at a forward operating base that officially did not exist. She had been 19 hours into a mission that was supposed to take 6 when she reached a soldier the rest of the team had given up on, and Kessler had been the commanding officer standing at the edge of the perimeter watching her work. He had not spoken to her that night, but he had looked at her the way people sometimes look at things they don't have words for, and she had filed that memory away in the part of herself she no longer opened. Now he was the one on the gurney. Corwin assumed command of the bay with the automatic confidence of someone who had never seriously considered that he might not be the best person for a given situation. He called for imaging, called for a chest line, called for vitals, in a tone that was slightly too loud for the space, and Lena tracked the numbers on the monitors with the quiet, involuntary attention of someone who had spent years reading exactly those numbers under far worse conditions. What she saw made her stomach tighten. The asymmetry in his chest wall was visible from where she stood. The jugular distension was pronounced. His oxygen saturation was dropping in a pattern she had seen before in a forward medical station in the dark, with a man who had 30 seconds left by the time her hands found the problem. Kessler opened his eyes. He looked at Corwin. He looked at the ceiling. He looked around the bay in the slow, effortful way of someone burning the last of their available energy on a single necessary task. And then his gaze found Lena standing at the back of the room, in her oversized scrubs, as still as she had trained herself to be. His hand came up. His finger pointed directly at her. "Specter," Kessler said. The word was barely a whisper, but the trauma bay was the kind of room where whispers carried. "I only trust Specter." The monitors kept beeping. Everything else in the room went quiet in the particular way that meant every person present had stopped what they were doing simultaneously. Lena did not move. She felt the weight of every set of eyes in the room shift toward her, and she ran the calculation one more time as fast as she could. The saturation was at 81 and dropping. The trachea was deviated. The breath sounds on his left side were absent. Tension, pneumothorax. The pressure building inside his chest was compressing his heart and his remaining lung simultaneously, and the window for intervention was measured in minutes, not in the time it would take Corwin to order the right imaging and reach the right conclusion through the right channels. If she did nothing, the man died in this room. Corwin was already asking for a portable chest X-ray. The request would take 4 minutes minimum to fulfill. Kessler had fewer than 3. Lena stepped forward. She moved through the cluster of residents and nurses with a directness that did not invite interruption, and she placed herself at the side of the gurney and stated the diagnosis clearly, without inflection: tension, pneumothorax, left side immediate needle decompression, required. Corwin turned toward her with the expression he used when he felt his authority was being tested by someone who should know better. He told her that she was a floor nurse, that she was not authorized to initiate invasive procedures, and that if she touched this patient, he would have her removed from the bay. His voice was measured and hard, the voice of a man who had used it before to make people step back. Cole Danner spoke before Lena could respond. "Let her work," Danner said. He said it the way people say things when they are not making a request, and Corwin looked at him, and something in Danner's stillness resolved the question faster than any argument could have. Corwin stepped back. Lena worked. She found the landmark by touch and confirmed it by sight in under 4 seconds. The needle went in at the correct intercostal space with a precision that did not come from hospital training, because hospital training did not account for the variables she had learned to work around: poor visibility, limited equipment, a patient whose physiology was already compensating for blood loss in ways that changed the feel of the procedure. The rush of air that followed the decompression was audible. The monitors responded within seconds. Kessler's saturation began climbing 83, 87, 91, and the color that had been draining from his face started to return in the slow, visible way that meant the pressure had been released before it became irreversible. The residents nearest the gurney were looking at Lena's hands. Danner was looking at her face. He said quietly, and without particular inflection, "That's not nursing. That's battlefield training." It wasn't a question. Kessler opened his eyes again. His breathing had steadied, still labored, still careful, but no longer the shallow, desperate work it had been 60 seconds ago. He found Lena without searching this time. "Specter," he said again. "Not a request now. Just recognition." Lena set down the needle. She did not look at Corwin, who had not spoken since Danner told him to step back. She did not look at the residents who were still watching her. She looked at the monitors and verified the numbers one more time, and then she looked at Adrian Kessler, who was the only person in this room who knew exactly what that name meant and exactly who it belonged to. 3 years. Every deliberate choice, the 2 large scrubs, the downcast eyes, the silence in the face of Corwin's contempt. The careful architecture of a life designed to leave no traceable outline had been built toward one purpose. She had wanted to disappear. She had needed to disappear, and she had been disciplined enough and patient enough to make it work. And in the span of 90 seconds, with 1 pointed finger and 3 syllables, it was over. Danner was already on a radio, his voice low and controlled. Barrett had repositioned near the bay entrance. The room was beginning to move again around her, the residents recalibrating Corwin, rearranging his posture toward the monitors, with the careful neutrality of a man deciding how to process what had just happened. Kessler's eyes had closed again, his body finally releasing into the sedation a nurse was administering. The immediate crisis had passed. Lena stood in the center of the trauma bay she had spent 3 years making herself invisible in. The name she had buried had just walked back into the light, and the worst part. The part she was only beginning to understand, as she stood there with the evidence of her own hands still visible in the steadied rhythm of the Admiral's breathing, was that she would make the same choice again. She would always make the same choice. That was what 3 years of silence had never been able to change. Dr. Gareth Bellamy arrived at the trauma bay before Kessler had even been transferred to a monitored room. He came with the hospital's legal counsel at his shoulder and the particular expression of a senior administrator who has just been informed that something happened on his floor that he did not authorize. He pulled Lena out of the bay and into the corridor with the practiced efficiency of someone who had delivered difficult conversations before and had stopped finding them difficult. The charges were straightforward, at least the way Bellamy framed them. She had performed an invasive procedure without a physician's order. She had exceeded her licensed scope of practice. Her personnel file contained no documentation of advanced certification in emergency needle decompression. The hospital was now exposed to liability in ways that Bellamy clearly found more alarming than the fact that the man in Bay 1 was currently breathing because of what she had done. He spoke in the measured, careful tone of someone who was already composing the incident report in his head. And when Lena told him plainly that Kessler would have died in the time it would have taken to follow the correct protocol, Bellamy's expression did not change. The protocol, he said, existed for a reason. Her job was to follow it. He suspended her from clinical duties, effective immediately. Lena received this information with the same stillness she brought to most things, which Bellamy likely interpreted as acceptance. It wasn't. It was the trained response of someone who had learned in contexts far more dangerous than a hospital corridor that visible reaction was a form of information you didn't want to give away for free. Cole Danner found her 2 minutes later. He came around the corner from the direction of the security office with the unhurried speed of someone who had already assessed the situation and decided that moving faster would not improve it. He told her about the man in the gray jacket. Someone had approached the admissions desk within 20 minutes of Kessler's arrival, asking for patient information using language that was specific enough to suggest he already knew roughly where to look. The security cameras had also picked up 3 vehicles circling the hospital's perimeter at intervals that didn't match any pattern a civilian driver would produce. Federal backup had been contacted, Danner said, but the nearest available team was 40 minutes out. He said it without apology, which Lena appreciated. There was no point apologizing for a timeline. Danner looked past her toward Bellamy, who was still standing near the bay entrance, conferring with the legal counsel, and told him with the same flat economy he used for everything that the nurse he had just suspended was the only person currently inside Liberty Cross, with both the medical knowledge to keep Kessler alive through a secondary complication and the tactical background to recognize a professional threat response when it was happening around her. He said the federal team would arrive in 40 minutes. He suggested Bellamy consider what 40 minutes without Lena Marlowe might look like. Bellamy reinstated her without putting it in those words. He said the suspension was deferred pending review. Lena didn't correct his phrasing. The first thing she did was stop thinking about the hospital as a hospital. She had done this before the cognitive shift that turned a building into a terrain map that replaced rooms with positions and hallways with sightlines. It happened faster now than it used to, which told her something about how thoroughly she had convinced herself she had left all of this behind. The south entrance had a full glass frontage, which meant anything moving toward it was visible from outside, and anything outside was visible to anyone inside who knew to look. The main elevators were a liability, too slow, too predictable, too easy to pin. The corridor between radiology and the service stairs had a natural bottleneck that would work against a team moving in either direction. The loading dock entrance off the east wing connected to the service hallway, running directly beneath the patient floors, and that connection meant it was the access point a trained team would use if they wanted to move through the building without touching the public areas. She had learned all of this in the way you learn things when you have nothing else to do with your attention, quietly, incrementally, over 3 years of night shifts that most of her colleagues found tedious. She also knew the access codes to every automated door panel in the service corridors, because night shift maintenance ran through those panels and the charge nurses rotated the responsibility. 3 years of quiet, invisible work had given her something no one had intended to give her: complete knowledge of the building's operational skeleton. The old records storage room on the far side of radiology was the best defensive position in the building. One entrance, reinforced walls from a renovation project that had updated the structural supports but never finished converting the space. No exterior windows, a connecting door to the service corridor that gave an alternate exit if the main entry became compromised, and close enough to the surgical suites that if Kessler's condition changed, they could move him without losing critical time. Danner listened to her assessment without interrupting, which was not something she had experienced often in this building. When she finished, he said they would do it her way, and he said it in a tone that made clear he had already arrived at the same conclusion independently and was confirming rather than deferring. Lena organized the transfer under the cover of an infection control precaution, a plausible reason to move a patient quietly that wouldn't generate the kind of visible disruption that spread through a hospital floor, the way smoke spread through a building, finding every gap. Nathan Corwin found her in the hallway while she was coordinating with Barrett on the transfer route. He had clearly been standing there for a moment before she acknowledged him, which meant he had chosen not to interrupt rather than not knowing how. That was new. He asked in a voice that was several registers lower than his usual frequency whether there was something he could do. Lena told him the most useful thing he could do was keep the emergency department functioning normally. Noise and disruption would make it easier for whoever was outside to track movement inside, and a chaotic ED was a navigational gift to anyone trying to locate a specific patient. Corwin nodded. He turned to go, then looked back at her. Not the evaluating look he used on residents, not the dismissive look she had absorbed from him for 3 years, but something else entirely. Something that didn't have a place in the version of Nathan Corwin she had catalogued. He walked back toward the ED without another word, and Lena watched him go for exactly the 2 seconds she could afford to spend on it, and then she went back to work. The transfer took 11 minutes. Kessler was moved, the room was secured, and Barrett posted himself at the single entrance, while Danner ran a check on the external camera feeds from a tablet linked to the security system. For approximately 4 minutes, everything in the records room was as controlled as the situation allowed. Then the monitor alarmed. Kessler's oxygen saturation had dropped again, not as precipitously as before, but with the particular pattern that told Lena the chest drain had partially occluded. It was a mechanical issue, not a new clinical crisis, but mechanical issues in a compromised post-trauma patient had a way of becoming clinical crises with very little warning. She was at his side before the second alarm sounded, identified the blockage by running her fingers along the drainage tubing, and cleared it with a correction that took under 90 seconds. The numbers climbed back. Kessler didn't fully wake, but his breathing settled into the rhythm that meant his body had stopped fighting against itself for the moment. She was straightening up when Barrett's voice came from the doorway. He had been monitoring the loading dock feed on a secondary screen, and what he had seen in the last 2 minutes was 3 individuals entering through the East Wing service entrance in a pattern that no hospital worker or delivery crew would produce. They maintained spacing. They checked corners before committing to a direction. They were using earpieces. The one in front was moving with the particular forward lean of someone who had been given a destination and was navigating toward it rather than searching, which meant they had information about the building's layout and specific information about where inside it they needed to go, Lena told Danner. Danner looked at the screen, looked at her, and reached the same conclusion she had already reached before she voiced it. The information those three men were operating on had not come from outside the building. The details about where Kessler had been moved, the specific routing that had happened in the last quarter hour, could only have come from a channel that was active after the transfer decision was made. Not a person. A device. Someone had gotten into the hospital's internal communication infrastructure almost certainly before Kessler arrived and had been listening to the facility's own systems since the moment he came through the door. Danner locked down the internal comms, immediately routing all coordination through the encrypted channel he and Barrett were already using. Then he looked at Lena in a way that told her he was about to object to something she hadn't said yet. She told him she was going into the corridor to slow them down. He pointed out that she had been away from fieldwork for 3 years and was currently unarmed. Lena told him that the building she had just spent 3 years memorizing every inch of was not a disadvantage. She said, "I was trained for this before I ever put on scrubs." And the way she said it was not a boast. It was a plain statement of relevant fact, in a moment that required plain statements of relevant fact. Danner authorized it with one condition: no direct engagement. Her function was disruption, split their formation, slow their approach, buy time. She moved into the service corridor and began using the building the way she had once used terrain. The lighting panel for the East Service Wing was in a utility closet she had stocked supplies from twice a week for 3 years. She killed the overhead lights in the section of corridor closest to the loading dock entrance, leaving only the emergency strips enough to see by, not enough to work confidently in. The secondary alarm panel near the radiology junction gave her access to the zone alerts, and she triggered the one covering the north stairwell, which sent an automated alert to the security desk and produced a sound in that wing that someone moving tactically would have to stop and assess. She used the automated door panels, the same ones she had entered the access codes for 100 times on night shifts, to open and close 2 sets of corridor doors in sequence, generating a pattern of sound that mapped to a location 60 feet from where she actually was. The first man followed the sound toward the north stairwell. The second moved down the service corridor on a line toward the radiology junction. Barrett came up through the connecting passage and intercepted him there with the efficiency of someone who did not need more than a few seconds to resolve the problem. The third man was the one in the gray jacket, and he was different from the other two in the way that mattered. He had recognized that the environment was working against him, and he had stopped following sounds and started following logic instead. He was moving slowly now, checking each intersection, building his own map of what was real and what had been constructed for him to follow. I was 40 feet from the records room corridor and closing. Lena was already moving to the one position she had saved for exactly this. She didn't go toward him. That was the thing a less experienced person would have done: moved to intercept, tried to cut him off in the corridor, turned the last 25 feet into a foot race that she might or might not win. Instead, Lena stepped back into the connecting passage beside the supply alcove and used the building the way she had used every other piece of terrain she had ever worked in. She left a gap. Not a gap that looked like a gap that looked like the only unguarded path remaining, the one that a trained man with a specific destination and a narrowing set of options would choose because the alternatives had already been closed off, and this one looked clean. She had spent the last 20 minutes making sure it looked clean. She had also spent the last 20 minutes making sure Cole Danner was already on the other side of it. The gray jacket man moved through the corridor junction at the careful, controlled pace of someone who had stopped trusting his environment but had run out of other ways forward. He checked the alcove. He checked the overhead. He did not check the connecting passage behind the supply cart, because the supply cart was positioned in a way that made it feel like a lower priority than the open hallway ahead. These were the decisions that trained people made under pressure, fast, logical, and occasionally wrong, because the person constructing the environment understood the logic better than the person navigating it. He stepped into the final corridor junction. Danner was already there. It was over in seconds. Danner moved with the precision of someone who had done this enough times that it no longer required conscious thought. And the gray jacket man went down, controlled, disarmed and secured, before he had fully processed that the approach he had spent the last 10 minutes calculating had been a path someone built specifically for him to walk. Barrett arrived from the radiology corridor 30 seconds later, with the second intruder restrained, and Lena stood at the junction entrance and listened to the building settle around her, the hum of the ventilation system, the distant sound of the ED still running its ordinary chaos, the monitors in the records room continuing their steady transmission. No shots fired, no patients disturbed. The people who had come to finish a job in a building they assumed would offer no meaningful resistance had encountered the one variable their intelligence had failed to account for. The federal team arrived 9 minutes later. By then, the hallways were quiet. The agent who ran the debrief introduced herself as Mara Voss. She worked through Danner and Barrett first, then came to Lena in the small conference room off the security office. Voss confirmed what Lena had assessed in the corridor. The leak had not come from any person inside Liberty Cross. It had come from a listening device embedded in the hospital's internal paging infrastructure, installed during a routine maintenance window in the weeks before Kessler's arrival. Whoever had planned the operation had not been improvising. They had prepared for the possibility that Kessler might reach a civilian medical facility and had laid the groundwork accordingly. What they had not prepared for was the particular skill set of the woman sitting across from Mara Voss, in a conference room that smelled like old coffee and printer toner. Voss asked Lena how she had identified the communication compromise as quickly as she had. Lena told her that the intruder's knowledge of the building was too specific to have come from external observation. The transfer to the records room had been arranged verbally through the hospital's internal system less than 15 minutes before the team entered from the loading dock. Outside surveillance could not have produced that information in that window. The conclusion was elementary once you accepted that the threat was more sophisticated than a standard opportunistic follow-up. Voss wrote something, then looked up and asked how Lena had predicted the final approach so precisely that Danner was already positioned before the man arrived. Lena answered without hesitation. I knew what he would do because I would have done the same thing in his position. When the environment is working against you, you go toward the path that looks least controlled. So I made one look that way. Voss closed her notebook and told Lena that her military record would remain in its current classification status. The events of tonight would be documented through federal channels that did not interface with Liberty Cross's civilian personnel systems. Specter would remain what it had always been, a name that didn't appear anywhere a civilian administrator could find it. Lena thanked her. The gesture was genuine, even if the comfort was limited. She had understood sometime around the moment she stepped into the service corridor that the architecture of her disappearance had already been demolished from the inside out. The classification of her file was a practical protection, not a restoration of anything she had lost. Kessler asked to see her the following morning, when the sedation had fully cleared and the surgical team had confirmed his overnight stability. He was sitting up at a shallow incline when she came in, and he looked at her with the alert, calibrated attention of a man whose body was significantly impaired and whose mind was not. He told her she had saved his life twice once, at a location that no longer existed on any official record, and once in this building, in front of people who had spent years deciding she wasn't worth a second look. He said both facts with equal weight. Lena told him she wasn't Specter anymore. She said it without force, not a protest, just a statement of where she had believed herself to be. Kessler was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You never stopped. You just stopped letting anyone see it." She had been prepared for some version of this, the argument that identity is permanent, that the past cannot be outrun. But the way he said it carried no instruction in it. He wasn't telling her to go back to anything. He was describing something she had not fully admitted to herself in 3 years of careful self-reduction. She told him the truth then that she had left because she couldn't continue carrying the weight of the losses that she had believed, with the same confidence she brought to clinical assessment, that removing herself from the environment would eventually stop the damage from accumulating. Disappearance as treatment. Distance as healing. Kessler said those were two different things, and that she had achieved one of them very effectively. Lena sat with that for a moment. What she had built in Charleston was not recovery. It was concealment, and recovery did not produce the same results, even when they shared some of the same behaviors. She had been organized, controlled, and consistent. She had not been honest with herself about what she was actually doing. Some truths don't need to be developed further once they're placed where both people can see them, and neither of them said anything else about it. Nathan Corwin found her in the hallway outside the records room later that afternoon. He came without announcement, without the forward projection of presence that she had spent 3 years registering from 2 corridors away. He asked her why she had never said anything. Not defensively. Genuinely the question of a man who had spent the night revising certain conclusions about himself and was not entirely comfortable with the results. Lena looked at him directly. She told him that in the beginning, speaking up would have cost more than absorbing the behavior, and by the time that balance shifted, the habit of silence had already settled in around reasons she couldn't easily explain. Then she told him the second truth, which was the more honest one, that in the early years, he wouldn't have heard her anyway. He had been listening to his own assessment of her. That was not the same thing as listening. Corwin didn't argue. He stood in the hallway for a moment, with the stillness of a man processing something he couldn't immediately resolve, and then he nodded and walked back toward the ED. No announcement, no declaration. Just a nod, and a man who had finally stopped talking long enough to hear something that had been true for 3 years. In the weeks that followed, the change was not dramatic. It lived in the texture of daily interactions, the way he stopped finishing other people's sentences in the trauma bay, the way he began asking questions in situations where he previously would have issued directives, the way he came to Lena before 2 difficult cases and asked what she saw rather than telling her what he had already decided. He acknowledged uncertainty in front of residents, which had the effect of making the residents more willing to acknowledge their own. It was not absolution. It was not meant to be. It was simply what happened when someone with enough intelligence finally pointed that intelligence at themselves. Gareth Bellamy withdrew the suspension formally at a board review 10 days after the incident. He said it directly, without waiting for the board's framing to carry the weight for him. He had prioritized liability over the reality of what had happened in that trauma bay, and that had been the wrong order of priorities. Dr. Helena Sloan, chairing the Clinical Standards Committee, told the assembled members that in 22 years of oversight, she had never encountered a case in which every investigative body involved had submitted a recommendation, identical in its essential conclusion, that the nurse had correctly identified a life-threatening emergency, had intervened with skill and precision that exceeded any reasonable standard of competency, and had subsequently organized a defensive response that protected the lives of everyone in the building. The board voted to expunge all adverse notations from Lena's file and formally recognized her contribution to both patient care and facility security. Lena was not present for the vote. She was on the fourth floor running a small group of residents through the mechanics of tension pneumothorax recognition, which was where she had been spending her free hours since the suspension was lifted. A third-year resident named Annika Sethi had come to her the morning after the incident, with questions precise enough that Lena spent 40 minutes answering them before she realized she was effectively teaching. The next session, there were 4 residents. The session after that, there were 7. Cole Danner was waiting outside the ED entrance on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after Kessler's admission, when Lena came off her shift. He told her that people who had worked with Specter still talked about her. He also told her that a joint program was being developed, military field medicine methodology applied to civilian trauma response, designed to give emergency physicians and nurses a framework for high-pressure, low-resource decision-making that conventional training didn't cover. The program needed someone who understood both worlds, someone who knew what a trauma bay and a forward operating base had in common, and where the gap between them could get people killed. Lena told him to send her the documentation. She wasn't ready to say yes to anything yet. But she was no longer pretending the skills didn't exist. And that shift, quiet as it looked from the outside, was the largest distance she had traveled in 3 years. On the morning Kessler was discharged, he walked through the ground floor corridor under his own power, slower than he would have liked, and steadier than the surgical team had projected. He stopped at the nurse's station, where Lena was completing her handoff notes. He extended his hand. She took it. "You were never hiding weakness," he said. "You were hiding command." She was standing in the hallway, where Nathan Corwin had corrected her in front of residents, where she had absorbed 3 years of deliberate diminishment, without a word, where she had built her invisibility one small concession at a time and told herself it was survival. She was standing in that exact same hallway, and the building was unchanged, and everything else was different. She didn't look at the floor. Specter did not go back to the field. She chose something else, a room full of residents who needed to know what she knew. A program that would carry that knowledge forward into emergencies. She would never personally witness a version of the work that didn't require her to disappear in order to do it. What this story leaves behind is something worth sitting with. The things we bury to protect ourselves have a way of becoming the very things other people need most. Lena didn't win because the world finally recognized her. She won because she stopped making herself small to accommodate people who hadn't earned that deference. The moment she acted not to prove anything, not to settle a score, but simply because someone needed what only she could give, that was when the 3 years of silence revealed what they had always been sitting on top of. You don't have to announce who you are, but you do have to stop apologizing for it. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been the person in the back of the room that no one looked at twice, subscribe to this channel. We tell these stories because they're true in the ways that matter, and because someone out there needs to hear them. Leave a comment, share it with someone who's been underestimated, and we'll see you in the next one.